There are four main groups of land plants. These are the bryophytes, the pteridophytes, the gymnosperms, and angiosperms. So in this lesson, we are going to discuss each of their specific description as well as their characteristic. Now, among these four main group of land plants, there is a difference between their characteristic with that of the algae, and most of the differences can be observed with regards to their reproduction or life cycle. So we are going to discuss later on the difference among these four main groups of land plants with that of your algae. The first group of land plants that we are going to discuss this morning are the bryophytes. An example of your bryophytes are the liverworts, the cornworts, and the mosses. So kung maalala nyo nung nakaraang talakayan natin, pinakita ko sa inyo yung mga larawan ng mga liverworts, hornworts, and mosses and some of their spot characteristic. Now, if we look at the description as well as the characteristic of bryophytes, one characteristic is that they do not have what we call a vascular tissue. So ano ba yung tinatawag natin na vascular tissue? So when we say vascular tissue, these are plant structures that carry your water as well as nutrients. So they are commonly known as the xylem and the phloem. If you can still recall in your previous lessons in biology, that a plant structure or particularly a plant contains a vascular tissue which is responsible in the transport of nutrients coming from the soil as well as water. And then other vascular tissues responsible in transferring nutrients that are produced during photosynthesis. Now, with regards to your bryophytes, they do not have this kind of plant tissue or the vascular tissue. The reason there is because of their size. They are so small, they can easily acquire or get the water that they need from their environment, because one of their characteristic is that they live in damp or moist environment. Usually they are found along sides of mountains, near rivers, or in forested areas that are mostly damp in their climatic condition. So that's the reason why they do not need a vascular tissue. So most of the time they are called as a non-vascular plant. Okay, so that is or those are some of the characteristics of your bryophytes. Among the four land-based plants or terrestrial plants, it is only your bryophytes that are non-vascular in nature. So it doesn't have its xylem and phloem, while the rest of the three groups are vascular. So when we say vascular, the main structure that is present is the xylem and phloem for transport of nutrients and water. Now, these three groups of vascular plants are usually arranged according to their order of evolution, meaning they are arranged on who among these three came out first, evolved in our planet. So the second group of plants, which is also known as one of the oldest group of land plants, is your pteridophytes. And most of the pteridophytes are your ferns, the horsetails, and the lycophytes, which you have viewed in our previous lesson. One of the characteristic of your pteridophytes is that they are seedless. So seedless because they do not produce seeds in their reproductive structure, but they instead produce or reproduce by means of your spores. Now, these spores are usually released from the inner sides of their leaves, and they are either transported by wind or by water, and from these spores, new plants or new group of plantlets evolve or develop. And then the third group of vascular plants, we have your gymnosperms. And under your gymnosperms, you have the conifers or cone-producing plants, such as your pine tree. We have the ginkgo, the cycads, and the topsids. Mostly this group of plants, if you can still recall from our previous lessons, some of these are ornamental in nature or being used as ornamental decorations. And some of these plants are also found in desert areas. Some of them are also found in cold climate environment. Now, there are two main characteristics of your gymnosperm. These are the early seed plants, and at the same time, they produce naked seeds. So their seeds are exposed, and they do not have any covering or hard covering to protect them. So these are some of the characteristics of your gymnosperms. And the fourth group of vascular plants or land plants are your angiosperms. Now these are now your flowering plants, or any plant that has flowers, any trees that has flowers are considered as angiosperms. Now, their seeds are protected by growing inside their ovaries. So, the seeds are developed inside their ovaries, and usually they are covered by a hard structure. And majority of the mother plants are in this group. So, those are the other three groups of land plants. The next slide shows some of the highlights of plant evolution. And if we look at the evolutionary tree of our four groups of land-based plants, we could see here that 600 million years ago, the earliest known ancestor are your green algae. So the land-based plants mostly evolved from an ancestral green algae, which is known as your charophyceans. So it took millions of years for this early known ancestor to evolve, where the origin of land plants came from. So from here, the the earliest group that evolved coming from your charophyceans are the bryophytes. Then later on, we have the pteridophytes, and then the gymnosperms, and the modern plants, your angiosperms. Okay? So if we look back on their evolutionary history, we could observe that the earliest group that evolved from the green algae are the bryophytes, or those that do not have any vascular tissue, and then followed by the pteridophytes, the gymnosperms, and then the angiosperms or flower-bearing plants. So these are the highlights of plant evolution. Going back to your bryophytes, one of the dominant generation in their life cycle of a bryophyte is the presence of your gametophytes. These are the male and female structure, or male sperm and female egg, that when they combine will produce a new plant. So the next slide shows pictures of bryophytes. Now, like what we have discussed a while ago, this group of land plants or your bryophytes are very small in size, and they usually grow in moist or damp places. And they are usually found along forest floors and along sides of mountains. So some of them, if we look closely, they have also tiny structure where their spores comes out, like this one. These are spores that are viewed under the microscope. So these are some of their structure and appearance. Now let us discuss some of the ecological and economic benefits of your bryophytes. Now, bryophytes were the world's only plants for 100 million years. So during the early history of our planet, the only group of plants that you can see or observe during that time are the bryophytes. Now, one example of your bryophyte is your peat bogs, or mostly known as your sphagnum moss. Okay? Now, your sphagnum has the ability to contain around 400 billion tons of carbon and cut down the amount of greenhouse gases. So, these tiny plants has the ability to absorb carbon dioxide in the air. So, it will help in decreasing the amount of greenhouse gases, thus preventing what we call as global warming. Now, for the economic benefit, peat or your sphagnum is harvested also. They are dried and it can be used as a fuel in other parts of the world where this particular moss grows abundantly. Now, sphagnum is harvested also and used as a soil conditioner and plant packing material. So if you observe some plants that you buy, there is the presence of your sphagnum moss, because this particular moss has the ability to provide nourishment to the soil, as well as it prevent the evaporation of water. So this is an example of an area or place where sphagnum or peat moss are usually found. So if you observe closely the environment, we could see that the environment is usually wet, or there are certain bodies of water that is present that provides for the requirements or water requirements of this particular group of plants. Okay, so if we look at the evolutionary tree, we have the charophytes, or the earliest known group of algae, or earliest ancestor of the four main groups of land plants. You have seen this a while ago in the other slides. So from the charophytes, you have the bryophytes, the pteridophytes, the gymnosperms, and the angiosperms. Now, going or proceeding to the next group of plant, or your pteridophytes. So, a while ago we said that the common characteristic of your pteridophytes is that they are seedless and they have the presence of your xylem and phloem. That's why they are considered as a vascular plant. Now, example of your pteridophytes or your seedless vascular plants, you have your Lycophyta, the Xylophyta, the Equisetophyta, and your Pterophyta. So this slide shows the picture of some examples of your pteridophytes, such as your fern, your horsetail, etc. Here we see in this slide the presence of a fern growing on the side of a tree. Okay. What you see here in this slide is a fern sporophyll. It is a leaf that is specialized for spore production. So if you look under the leaf of a fern, you will be able to observe the presence of these structures. And these structures are the one that releases your spores. If we use a microscope, we will be able to view this particular structure larger and much better, so that we could observe how the spores are released. And from here, we would be observing small round structures. These are now your spores, which are usually released to the environment to continue the life cycle of your fern. So looking further, using higher magnification, this is now the appearance of a spore under the microscope. So as you can observe here, spores are already released. Okay. So we have here a spore germinating, releasing now a new plantlet or small plant that grows into your fern. So this slide shows us a developing fern or a growing fern. So these are still very tiny in size. So these are some of the microscopic structure. And these are ferns growing along the side of a wood. Now let us discuss the importance of your pteridophytes. Now, your pteridophytes are the most dominant plants during the Carboniferous period. The Carboniferous period is a period in our Earth's history where there are the presence of large and giant trees. And from this period, there are extensive beds of coal that are produced from these plants. Now, coal is similar with your charcoal, but their difference is that coal are very hard, and at the same time they are rock-like in appearance. But when you use them for as a form of fuel, so parang nagbabagang uling din ang coal, and these coal are derived from the Carboniferous period. Now, proceeding with your gymnosperms, these are vascular plants that bear naked seeds. Their seeds are not enclosed in specialized chambers. And most of these gymnosperms evolved during the Mesozoic era. Now, the Mesozoic era is also known as the time of the great dinosaurs. So, during the time of the dinosaurs, your gymnosperms are very abundant. Now, there are 4 phyla of extant gymnosperms. So your gymnosperm evolved into different phyla or phylum. We have your phylum Ginkgophyta. An example is your Ginkgo biloba. Then we have your phylum Cycadophyta. Example is the cycads. Then we have your phylum Gnetophyta. An example is the Ephedra. And the phylum Coniferophyta, the example are your pine trees, firs, and spruces. So this one is an example of your ginkgo. These are example of your cycads. And these are example of your fir, spurs, as well as pine trees. The last group of land plants are your angiosperm or your flowering plants. So if we look at the evolutionary tree, we could observe here that your angiosperm evolved separately from the other groups. Okay? So it branched out into a different area. Unlike the other groups, such as your gymnosperms, they evolved separately. Okay? So they have a separate evolutionary history. Now, the angiosperm are known as the largest group of land plants. They are the most important economically, and they are apomorphous, meaning they have flowers, they have carpels, fruits, they undergo double fertilization with triploid endosperm, and they have a specialized conductive cells. If we look at the old classification of your angiosperms are classified either as a dicot or a monocot. Dicots and monocots, these are mostly based on the presence of a cotyledon in their seeds. Now, dicots have 2 cotyledons, or they have 2 cotyledons inside their seeds. Examples are your beans, etc. While your monocots contain only 1 cotyledon. A good example is your corn. So these are from the old classification. So looking at the evolution of monocotyledons, we can observe that it has 3 major characteristics. The characteristic of your monocotyledons is that it has only 1 cotyledon. It has a vasculator that is atactostelic, or its vascular cambium is absent, and also the leaf venation are parallel. So these are one of the characteristics that are observable in your monocotyledonic plants. Now, monocots include your palms, your orchids, your irises, grasses, etc., including your corn. So these are samples of plants that are monocotyledon, or it has only one monocot. The other group of angiosperms are your eudicots, which include your roses, legumes, daisies, and oaks. So those are the four main groups of land plants or terrestrial plants. If we recall, we have the bryophytes, the pteridophytes, the gymnosperms, and the angiosperms. So hopefully you have already memorized those four groups, because it will greatly help you in your classification as we go on further with our lesson.